Hi there, I'm Michael, and today I'm going to show you how I made this bowl out of colored pencils. Let's get started. My plan to start out with was to glue pencils in individually, and you can see here I started with a few in the middle and a few around the outside of where I was planning on the perimeter of my bowl to be. But I quickly realized that that was going to take way too long. So instead, I decided to get a cardboard concrete tube and just completely fill it with pencils and jam them in all at once rather than gluing them in individually. And then I could fill the entire thing with epoxy casting resin to harden everything up and make it so everything stays where I want it, and I have something that I can turn at the end. I began with 250 pencils, but soon realized that was not going to be enough. I had to take a quick trip to the store to get some more colored pencils, bringing my total up to 610 colored pencils for this bowl. With all of my colored pencils, I began dumping them out onto my workbench. Now, at this point, I was getting really excited about how much color this bowl was going to have in it. With the dry fit done, I knew I had enough colored pencils. The next step was get some epoxy and start filling my tube. As I was filling the concrete tube with colored pencils and epoxy, I began to run into a couple of issues. The biggest one being the colored pencils actually float in the epoxy, and it was very difficult to get them to all stay sunken down into the epoxy so I didn't have any gaps at the bottom. Basically, the way I got around this was cramming in the pencils as tightly as I possibly could, and then I weighted them down with some wood blocks and weights at the end. The second issue, trying to cram in as many possible pencils as I could, I actually ended up using more than the 610 colored pencils I had laying out. Luckily, I was able to scrounge up 10 more around my shop to get them crammed in as tightly as possible, which brings the total up to 620 colored pencils. "12 hours later, the epoxy was fully cured and it was time to get it on the lathe. My first step, once I actually began turning, was to cut the end off where the top of the pencils was and the wood piece of scrap that got stuck to the top, so I had one smooth surface to work with on the end. After that, my plan was to rough down the outside diameter of my blank to get the cardboard tubing off and get it down to a nice workable rough cut blank. With the cardboard cut away, I got another glimpse of what these pencils were really going to look like. Now, it was just the beginning, but you could already see some of these colors popping around the outside diameter of this bowl. Now that I had my blank cut down, it was time to begin shaping the outside of the bowl. Now, I originally wanted to go for a really dramatic shape, but the epoxy was a lot more difficult to turn than I was expecting, so I went with a little more simple shape that I knew I could get easily without spending 2 days trying to cut this thing down and sharpening my tools all the time. Once I had an outside shape that I was more or less satisfied with, I began to work on the inside of the bowl. This is when it got really difficult. Turning end grain into these colored pencils and the epoxy was just absolutely brutal on the tools, and it made it take so long. Sanding brought a whole new challenge. The low grit sandpaper dragged the colors from the pencils across the wood grain and across other pencils, causing them to bleed and blend together and turn into a huge mess. I overcame this by sanding very incrementally up to a high grit, finally ending with a 2500 grit sandpaper. And by sanding through to the high grit, I was able to achieve a very nice finish with no colors bleeding whatsoever. I finished the bowl using two different kinds of CA glue. First, I started with the thinnest I could find, which would hopefully fill in any holes that were left and give a very nice base coat. Then I moved on to a thicker CA glue. In this case, it was called gap filling CA glue, which put on a nice thick outside coat to protect all of these colors. And the end result looked gorgeous. At this point, it was time to remove it from the lathe. Now I did go and cut that wood base off completely later on and didn't include it in this video, but here you can see all of those colors along the outside of the bowl really pop and explode. There's so many different patterns and different cuts and shapes to the outside, and then on the inside you can see that cross section of all 620 colored pencils. That's how I made my colored pencil bowl. Hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. See you next time.